This is Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The organization charged with managing the regional response to homelessness is facing an existential crisis. Some local elected leaders have called for the dissolution of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority after a damning forensic audit from consulting firm Clark Nuber released last month. The audit reported the agency had lost track of at least $8 million, incurred $4 million of questionable administrative costs, and at one point operated with a negative cash flow of $44 million. The review found the $200 million agency, which started operations in 2021, didn't have the necessary oversight, accounting practices, or internal financial controls to handle large amounts of public money appropriately. King County and the city of Seattle fund the bulk of KCRHA. Now the city and county are at a decision point: reform the agency or shut it down. And that decision is likely to come this summer. KCRHA released a corrective action plan on Friday that outlines steps the agency will take over the next 60 days to respond to the audit. We'll talk about those plans and also what went wrong at KCRHA in the first place. How does the agency rebuild trust with the public? And what happens if the organization closes? Kelly Kinnison is the CEO of KCRHA, and she joins me now for an exclusive interview. Kelly, thanks very much for being back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Libby.
So I'm just going to run through some of the reactions from some local elected officials to the audit and let you kind of bounce off of those first and foremost. King County Councilmember Rod Dembowski called the audit a 5-alarm fire. Councilmember Reagan Dunn said in a statement, quote, "We owe it to taxpayers and those struggling with homelessness to utilize public dollars in the most effective, efficient, and impactful manner possible." Seattle City Councilmember Maritza Rivera said the audit, quote, "shows an egregious mismanagement of funds and an unacceptable lack of financial accountability." These are all members of their respective bodies who want to dissolve KCRHA. Do you agree with their assessment in terms of the severity of what the audit uncovered?
I do. I think it's a really serious inflection moment for KCRHA. And I think what we're understanding and what we've been sort of trying to grapple with as a region for several years is that we did not start KCRHA on a good foundation of financial practices. And our model is really challenging in that context. And so it's the evaluation findings are very serious. It's not a way to operate the $200 million a year budget from mostly public funds. And I think, we've got a lot of serious work to do if we're going to continue to handle those funds.
There was no fraud found explicitly in the audit, but the problems with the accounting practices and the millions of dollars that were unaccounted for did leave the question open about whether fraud did occur. So what is your assessment? Do you know, did taxpayer money get diverted or get stolen because of fraud at KCRHA?
My knowledge, no funds were diverted to purposes that were not intended outside of, our homelessness response system or in any other way. Clark Nuber was very direct in that they didn't review all of our transactions. They sample, which is an appropriate methodology. So that's sort of where they have to say, hey, we didn't look at every single thing, but there's no evidence that large-scale fraud took place. We've been examining internally at KCRHA our purchase card records, other, of our cash-like records. Ultimately, all of our funding needs to be sent out through the King County investment pool. That is where the warrant holder is, or the person authorized to spend money on behalf of KCRHA. And so we have a really detailed record of the funds that went out. So we're feeling, confident that funds were used for the intended purpose of homelessness response system services and shelter and all of those other things that we're responsible for.
You've been heading up KCRHA since August of 2024, so you overlap with this audit period by about a year. The audit period ended in July of 2025. Had you been noticing things, since you started, maybe issues with accounting practices, things like that? Or Were you surprised by the results of the audit?
My experience was, coming in from federal government and having that context, I was very surprised at what I found at KCRHA. I'm a lot of things. I'm not an accountant, and so, relied on our accounting team at the time to kind of get me up to speed on our financial model, on our cash position, on how we did business. That took a couple of months, and it was very clear to me that something was not fitting together. So, when I came on, I was one of two senior executives at the agency at the time, permanent. The other one started the same day as I did. So if that gives you sort of a level of like existing leadership, oversight, accountability. Our CFO at the time was a Robert Half contractor. And we had a wonderful person on loan from King County who was just trying to keep the agency doing business until I arrived.
And I think there had been, is it 5 CEOs in 5 or 6 years? There'd been a lot of turnover in leadership.
That's right. And the systems that we were using were really not the right systems. And that was a choice that was made, back in 2021, 2022. We're using a lot of spreadsheets. When you're working on very little administrative funding and people don't, for good reasons, sometimes want to invest in big systems, you work in spreadsheets and in journals. And I didn't realize for a while that folks didn't realize that was the case here on our 5 to 7% administrative budget. And it was. And this is sort of the outcome of that, taking on that risk. But we very quickly realized we needed, something was wrong and we needed to proceed with cleaning up our financial situation.
That use of journaling, kind of open spreadsheets, a lot of different people having access to be able to edit expenditures and line items and things. That was one of the things that the review uncovered as being, poor management of public dollars. I mentioned that the $8 million went unaccounted for without a paper trail. There were administrative costs overspent by $4 million that included interest costs of over $1 million. The negative cash flow as kind of like the modus operandi was another thing that the report highlighted. And again, the tracking of things in spreadsheets and kind of in ways that, didn't have like strong oversight. One of the other things that the report highlighted were these long periods of time between expenditures, so outflow of money, and then invoicing. So sometimes it would be 12 or 16 months before an invoice would go in for something that, money that had flown out the door already. When something, gets out of control like this, I think you were talking about the ways in which the agency was spun up in the beginning. I've heard it referenced as like a startup environment. At what point do you think KCRHA needed to kind of evolve into, a fully grown organization? And like, when do you think the brakes should have been put on here for the financial management to be under control?
Oh, it's such a hard question for someone who gets the, privilege of looking back. To be fair, I didn't live in this community and so didn't see everything that folks were grappling with, how the pandemic, affected Seattle versus where I was living at the time in Washington, D.C. But I will say, as a public servant, right, and someone who approaches my work as a civil servant, love the startup energy and that tension between risk tolerance and innovation is one that's present for so many, I'm sure, of our listeners who are in business and entrepreneurs. The public is very risk averse with their tax dollars. And so that's a proposition that just is tricky from the get-go. And so then starting it with a little bit of like, hey, okay, here's all the contracts. We know you don't really have any staff yet. Figure out how to do this in a new way, I think was just really problematic, not a recipe for success.
So it was really from the inception point, is what you're saying.
I think so. I mean, I think setting up a scrappy agency with public dollars is really, really hard. You have to have continuity of accountability and auditability and spending. And I think there was a desire to do something different at the time, which I really, really respect. And that always is just so fraught with public dollars.
What is the number one thing KCRHA is doing right now in response to the audit?
Well, I would say that when I came, I think part of the reason I came was because of my background in government and in managing public funds. And so we've been in a continuous improvement posture since I arrived. Right now, we are really digging into consistent, reliable reporting, consistent, reliable invoicing. So you may remember there were a lot of problems early on, providers getting paid. And so rightly so, you shift the priority to money has got to go to providers so they can continue providing these vital services. When a small, scrappy agency makes that a priority, you are, deprioritizing other ththings like making sure, the right receipts got attached to the right account, even though we know the money got paid and the community received the services. We seem to have not been good about making sure we were getting paid by our funders, and probably other issues. We're evolving. I think we have matured a great deal, and brought those public accountability principles into the agency. And so just that cash flow between us and our funders and providers, and traceability, auditability, is a high priority right now.
So does that mean, are you bringing in like new accounting people? Are you bringing in consultants at this point? All of this, of course, costs money to, spin up a new system and new accountability procedures. There's got to be training. There's got to be personnel. Is that happening right now, or is that something you're going to have to budget for? Like, how does one move forward? How does the agency move forward with that?
So we've requested an accountant position from our governing board, who is approving our hires right now. We're waiting to hear back about the approval to move forward with that position. That's a critical position in terms of working on that $8 million traceability issue, and many of the other issues we have, while also doing our regular book of business. In our corrective action plan, we are asking for some external support. The nature of that is really not just more staff hours, which we do desperately need, but there's some, competencies that our team just does not have in-house. And we need to bring those competencies to bear on this sort of redesign of our financial processes.
So moving forward, will there be like a single accounting system, where you don't have the journaling, the spreadsheets, the multiple people kind of with access? Like, is there a plan to implement one system that is easily reviewable, has the oversight mechanisms in place?
We're looking at all of those options right now. We use a number of tools at the moment. All of them are, do good things, which is why we're using them, but we don't have that synergy between them that we need. So some options there are paring the number of systems down, focusing on one and using the others as supplemental. We're in an accounting shop, you're always going to need to have a spreadsheet for something, right? Or use journal entries, but those need to be logged, and very transparently cataloged in ways that we have not done to date.
City Council member Rob Saka said on the Seattle Channel recently that, it's going to take a lot of administrative costs to fully remediate these problems. We've kind of touched on this already, but do you have the funds to do that in addition to your mandate?
We have funds to make progress, and pursue our mandate. The way forward that we've laid out is really asking our governing board to decide what their priorities are for us, how quickly, some of these changes need to be made. We've addressed the high risk areas, immediately. A lot of those areas were things where we had policies, they weren't final. Sometimes we didn't have the oversight to make sure people were following them to the level that we need to. And so that was, cleanup that we were able to do immediately once it was identified. Some of these other questions are really regional questions around what is the model going forward? Does this work? Can an agency blend and braid funding from the city and the county in a way that's effective for providers, for that agency, and for the city and county? So those conversations, require people resources. We definitely need some more staff competencies in-house to move quickly. And we've laid all of that out for our funders to consider.
KCRHA's own point-in-time count has shown that the number of people living unsheltered has increased, over the agency's tenure. This is obviously a top concern for people living in our region. The mission of KCRHA is to significantly decrease the incidence of unsheltered homelessness across King County. Do you think that the issues detailed in this financial review impacted the core work that the agency has supposed to be, responsible for? Like, I know non-payment to providers is certainly an issue that could impact core work, right? Are there any specific instances or any overall impression of, did this impact the way KCRHA was able to pursue its mission?
I think at the moment that because it was a focus to not impact providers, the issues that we have are not directly impacting them, at least not to the extent that in the early years. I mean, in the early years, it was really disastrous for providers who were trying to pay their staff to provide the services that they were contracted to provide. We also had, emergency funding that went out during the pandemic. There was a mention in the evaluation about use of purchase cards to do hoteling, which was just I think a need at the time to get folks inside when people were dying. So I do think these interact with services, and I think the extent to which that is happening has calmed down since we are no longer in a pandemic. We have a few more years of experience, under our hats. We've implemented a Salesforce system, which is a huge improvement over the system that we were using prior. And that just added a lot of transparency between us and the providers. So that was really a focus, and that's where we focused, is making sure provider and continuity of the care for our community was in place.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman, and I'm talking with Kelly Kinnison, CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. We're going to be right back after a quick break here on Soundside on KUOW. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. I'm talking with Kelly Kinnison, who is the CEO of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Listeners may know the authority has been under fire lately because of a pretty damning financial review that found at least $8 million went unaccounted for. There was overpayment of administrative costs, working at a cash deficit of negative $44 million at a time. A lot of problems uncovered in this review, which has now created these big questions, which I think were already simmering, certainly in our region, but really brought them to the fore about the future of the agency and whether Seattle and King County will continue to fund it. At this point, King County Executive Gurmai Zahalai has been asked by the county council to pursue this 90-day review of the agency. Executive Zahalai is supposed to have a report to the council by August 1st, and that report is going to detail the steps that KCRHA has taken to rectify issues brought up by the audit and create what is being dubbed a decision framework for how the county is going to move forward. So what's your role right now in terms of how the agency is taking part? And are you working with the executive's office, or what are you doing right now in terms of that review?
Yeah, so we've continued working with the city and our King County partners. There's a lot of interaction with their teams at different levels of the organization every week. They've convened a special working group weekly at this point, so that we can troubleshoot issues as they come up, work through what the corrective action plan looks like, where we need to prioritize and things like that. We're very grateful to have a finance committee stood up as part of our governing board. Executive Zahalai is taking part in that. And we know that the finance committee needs more insight and transparency in terms of what's happening with the financials at KCRHA and how all of these issues get addressed over time, in particular before those late summer deadlines for council.
CEO Kinnison, I know that this is tough because you're the leader of the organization, but you've been there, you've seen the inner workings, and you've kind of seen this built in, from the inception point, I think, dysfunction, not only in the organization, but in how the region has or has not gotten behind KCRHA. There's been this big issue with suburban cities not signing on, most of them. Seattle and King County have shown kind of inconsistently whether they believe in KCRHA or whether they want to go it alone. And so I guess my question to you is very basic. That is, do you think that KCRHA is worth saving?
I do, Libby. And I'll tell you that when I arrived and got a little bit of a sense of what was going on here, I told, high-level folks at the city and county at the time, like, there are some real problems here, and I don't know enough yet, but, I'll tell you if this is just not going to work. We are a different organization than we were when I walked in the door August 2024. We've come, so far in some of our data assets, our staffing. We have real expertise in-house and knowledge that goes back, years and years through pre-KCRHA days about how the homelessness response system has evolved, all the other things that have been tried and also didn't work well. So we're in a place now where I think we need to stick with something and iterate and make it better and be honest about what doesn't work and sort of lean in there. I think the sort of hesitance, it's like in a relationship, right? If you never decide, yeah, I'm in this and I'm giving it a shot, did it ever have a chance? And I think, countywide, I've had a lot of folks reach out all over saying they've seen tremendous differences in how we do work that impacts them. We're doing things differently than was done before KCRHA and was done during the early years of KCRHA. And they're hopeful that we can pull through this in a responsible way, that we're taking accountability, and that the region needs a regional backbone. And KCRHA has, all the pieces in place to do that.
Just on a really simple level, for somebody who's not familiar with the intricacies of how the county and city and this interagency, interlocal agreement work, what is the benefit of having a separate agency, besides having the county do its work, the city do its work? Like, what is the upside of KCRHA at a basic level?
At a basic level, I would say two things. One is it pulls homelessness policy and response out of local governments that have transitions in leadership very frequently, which, is a good model. There are reasons to do that. Homelessness is a problem that takes 5 and 10 years of strategic thinking, investment, and direction before you start to see the benefits of that. And so if we're switching back and forth priorities and investments every few years, it's a reason why we're not really able to get traction. Two, I think that what providers have it really difficult in this space. They are the ones on the front lines. They are the one delivering services, and they then have to interact on the back end with a bunch of different payment sources. So some of our big ones are getting direct federal money through us, They were getting, federal money from the city or county, local money from the city and county, philanthropic money. And so that creates a really complex back end for those providers. And one of the biggest benefits of KCRHA that's up and running, we're seeing dividends on, is there's a single payer system for our providers now. There's also a single point of contact, a single source of compliance and monitoring. That's all been very strong and getting stronger. And so especially medium and smaller providers are not having to deal with 2-3 funders, 2-3 audits, contract monitoring visits from 2 or 3 funders. All of that is condensed at KCRHA, and it saves them staff time and money.
So right now, there is this huge question on the minds of the elected folks in our region who are going to make these decisions, the county council and the city council primarily. Some people have already decided KCRHA is not working, it's got to go. But there are, the bulk of people seem to be really trying to figure this out. And there's going to be that 90-day review period with the county. The city's going to have its review process. On your side of things, how do you rebuild trust, not just with these decision makers, but with the public as well, who, now in their minds are thinking, this is just another example of government, and they couldn't get things working. They wasted our money. How do you rebuild trust at this point?
Yeah. From my perspective, what we did with the audit was really necessary to uncover some of these things so we could fix them. There were a bunch of things we knew kind of were happening that needed to happen in different ways, stronger controls, things like that. And there were also just back end problems that are hard for someone who's not fully enmeshed in an accounting and finance framework to sort of pick out and dissect. And so I'm actually very grateful for the expertise at Clark Nuber. As a public servant, I felt like, great, we're going to bring them in. They're going to give me this map, right, to fix what's wrong. And frankly, I guess I live it every day, but I'm a little surprised at the surprise. I mean, if you go back and read some of the news articles, like, did folks think this was sort of all just sailing right along and, all the back end was looking good? Because, there were clear signs that things were not functioning properly in the early days. And I know there's trade-offs and there's funding constraints and, folks have a lot of things on their plates, but no one stopped and said, whoa, we need to think about this. We maybe need to adjust what we're asking them to do or how much we're providing in administrative funding so they can do this right and mitigate all of this risk that ended up compounding over the years.
Do you think people were worried about looking under the hood? Like they didn't want to find what was going to be under there?
I think it's always dicey. I've been, needing to really take accountability for a lot, and that's hard. And it's also true. I made choices. I had priorities. And I'm lucky in that I don't have to never run for office, right? So I don't have to run for office or answer to constituents. I answer to a community of folks who have nowhere to live, nowhere to sleep tonight. And so for me, it was like, yeah, this is going to be rough, but we've got to know. And it might come back that this is not the thing, and we need to think about what's next. As a regional solution, again, I'm a public servant, so I'll do what is in the best interest of this work. But I think it's KCRHA, and I think we've made really solid investments, and we can do this. But I need to earn trust back from folks who really feel like, things should have been fixed faster, or I should have made different decisions, or the agency should have. I'm hoping we can separate some of that out in our corrective action plan and really show where, these are intersecting issues that, we have to take accountability for some of them as a region. But there's a lot that KCRHA needs to fix.
Is there anything else that you want people to know before we go?
I think the key thing for me is that everyone at this agency is working to fulfill our mission, and that We all know it's highly imperfect, but there has been this continuous improvement, frankly, over the whole lifespan of KCRHA. Juggling a lot of even direct services at the beginning. We're out of that business now. But when folks are thinking about this agency, I hope they'll think about community members who are trying to serve fellow community members, and really doing their best and willing to show up and do the right things. And we just, would really like some support and a framework for doing that.
Well, I know it's not an easy job, and you knew it when you took over. I think probably that this was not going to be an easy role to take over as CEO of King County Regional Homelessness Authority. Uncertainty makes that all the more difficult, I'm sure. But I just really appreciate that you were willing to sit down and really go through all of these tough questions about what happened at the agency, the future, everything like that. And I hope we can keep the conversation going. King County Regional Homelessness Authority CEO Kelly Kinnison, thank you very much.
Thank you, Libby.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.